I'd been hiding from my mob family for 3 years when a customer told me, "Your cousin says hi." I kept scanning his items like nothing had happened, like my whole body hadn't just gone numb. The customer was already walking away, just a guy in a baseball cap buying a soda. But those words changed everything. Nobody here knew I had a cousin. Here I was Stella, and Stella didn't have family. But before that, I was Isabella Torino, who had dozens of cousins. Cousins who were out for blood ever since I testified against them. I forced myself to keep working, bagging groceries for the next customer, an elderly woman buying cat food. But my mind was racing through escape routes and contingency plans I'd made 3 years ago. They'd found me in this tiny Nebraska town where I'd been stupid enough to think I was safe. My manager Greg walked by and asked if I was feeling okay because apparently I'd been standing there holding a can of soup for 30 seconds without moving. I mumbled something about not enough sleep and continued scanning, but every beep of the register sounded like a countdown to something terrible. 4 more hours left on my shift, and I couldn't leave early without raising questions I didn't want to answer. Every customer who came through my line could be watching me, reporting back to the family about my blonde hair and name tag that said Stella. The man buying a single bottle of water who paid with 100. The woman who kept staring while I counted her change. Were they real customers or scouts sent to confirm it was really me? I thought about running right then, just walking out the door and driving until I hit Canada. But that's what stupid people did, and stupid people ended up in car trunks. The family was patient and methodical, and they'd probably been watching me for weeks before making contact, learning my routines and relationships. They knew about David, the paramedic I'd been dating for 6 months. They knew about my Tuesday night book club and my Saturday morning runs. My hands shook as I handled money and I kept dropping things. Coins scattering across the floor. A jar of sauce shattering in aisle 3. Greg asked if I needed to go home sick, but I said no, because running would make it worse. They knew where I worked now, probably knew where I lived, and panicking would only make me easier to catch. A man came through my line buying zip ties, plastic sheeting, and bleach. And normally that combination would just be someone doing home repairs, but today it made my stomach turn. He smiled at me while I rang him up and said something about the weather, but all I could think about was my cousin Polly, who'd handled problems for the family until he got caught with a body in his trunk. During my break, I hid in the bathroom and tried to think, but my mind kept circling back to what happened to Aunt Marie when she tried to leave the family. They brought her back in a wheelchair, and she never said what they did to her, just sat at family dinners staring at nothing with clouded eyes. That was 20 years ago, and she still couldn't walk, still couldn't speak above a whisper. I splashed cold water on my face and stared at myself in the mirror, at this stranger with badly bleached hair and dark roots showing through. 3 years I'd been Stella. 3 years of lying to everyone about where I came from and why I had no family photos. 3 years of building something normal and quiet and safe, and it was all crumbling because I'd been stupid enough to use my mother's birthday when I created my new identity. 3 more hours of scanning and bagging while pretending my life wasn't collapsing. A customer complained I'd double-charged them, and I had to call Greg over to void the transaction, while my face burned with embarrassment and fear. Every minute that passed without something happening made it worse because I knew they were out there, waiting, enjoying my terror. The family liked the waiting almost as much as the violence because fear was a tool they'd perfected over generations. When my shift finally ended, I changed out of my uniform with shaking hands and went to my car, checking the back seat before getting in. No one followed me home, but there was a business card under my windshield wiper that just said, Torino Construction, with the Chicago address I recognized as one of the family's legitimate fronts. My apartment building looked normal, but my heart was hammering as I climbed the stairs. The hallway was empty and my door was locked just like I'd left it. But when I walked inside, my cousin Tony was sitting on my couch reading one of my magazines like he belonged there. He looked up and smiled, older and grayer than 3 years ago, but still wearing one of those expensive suits he loved. He said, "Isabella, you look good as a blonde." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and said, "Get out." He laughed and stood up, straightening his tie. He said, "The family invested $2 million in legal fees because of your testimony. Uncle Sal's doing 25 to life, Cousin Ricky got 15 years, and the Fed seized 3 restaurants. You cost us a lot." I said, "I don't have any money." He said, "You think I care? Don't pretend like you don't know how to get your hands dirty when you have to. $2 million plus interest. Or everyone in your nice little life finds out who you really are, right before they start having accidents." Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I wanted to throw the knife at him, but my arm wouldn't move, frozen while my brain screamed at me to do something. Tony walked toward me slowly with his hands up like he was calming a scared animal, and I backed against the kitchen counter until there was nowhere left to go. He stopped a few feet away and his smile never changed, just patient and calm like he had all the time in the world. He told me the family had been watching for 6 weeks, that they knew about David and his Tuesday paramedic shifts, about my book club meetings at the library, about my Saturday morning runs through the park. They knew I bought the same coffee every morning at the shop on 5th Street, and that I always worked the early shift on Thursdays. His voice stayed friendly and casual like we were catching up at a family dinner instead of him threatening everyone I cared about. He explained that $2 million wasn't negotiable, but I had options for how to pay it back. and the family was willing to be reasonable about the timeline if I cooperated and stayed put. He said running would just make things harder for me and anyone who tried to help me disappear. The knife felt heavy in my hand and completely useless because what was I going to do? Stab my cousin in my apartment and explain that to the police. Tony reached past me to grab an apple from the bowl on my counter, taking a bite while he waited for me to say something. I asked how long I had, and he said that depended on how smart I was about this, that the family appreciated people who understood business. He finished the apple and tossed the core in my trash like he lived here, then straightened his tie again and headed for the door. He turned back and reminded me that everyone I'd built a life with here was real to me, but just leverage to the family and accidents happen to people all the time. Then he walked out through my front door like a normal visitor leaving after a normal conversation. I stood there holding the knife for maybe 2 full minutes after he left, my legs shaking so bad I thought I might fall. Then I ran to the door and locked it, checking the deadbolt 3 times before wedging a chair under the handle. I went to every window in the apartment and made sure they were locked, pulling the curtains closed even though it was still light outside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I pulled out my phone and searched for how to find hidden cameras, reading through dozens of articles that just made me more scared. Every article said to look for tiny holes, check smoke detectors, examine outlets and light fixtures, scan for wireless signals. I spent the next 2 hours taking apart every smoke detector in my apartment and checking behind every picture frame on the walls. I unscrewed outlet covers and looked inside, examined the vents, checked under furniture and inside lamps. I found nothing, but that didn't mean nothing was there, just that I wasn't smart enough to find what they'd hidden. The not knowing felt worse than finding something because at least then I'd understand what they could see. I went to the bathroom and pried up the baseboard behind the toilet where I'd hidden my emergency cash 3 years ago. The plastic bag was still there with $3,000 in 20s and 50s, money I'd been saving from every paycheck for exactly this kind of situation. I counted it twice to make sure it was all there, then started packing a go bag with clothes, my fake ID documents, toiletries, and the cash. The practical actions helped me breathe slower and think more clearly instead of just panicking. I pulled out my phone and typed a text to David explaining everything, telling him who I really was and why I had to leave. Then I read it back and realized sending it would just put him in danger, make him a loose end the family might need to tie up. I deleted the message word by word until my phone was blank again. The go bag went in my closet behind my winter coats where I could grab it fast if I needed to run. I thought about calling 911, but what would I even say to them? My cousin visited me and made some vague comments about accidents. He didn't hit me or pull a weapon, didn't make specific threats they could arrest him for. Without proof of immediate danger or actual crimes happening right now, calling the police might just speed up the family's timeline. They'd know I was trying to get help, and that would make them act faster before I could build any kind of case. I took the knife from the kitchen and put it under my pillow, then changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt but kept my shoes right next to the bed. I lay there in my clothes staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound in the hallway, my heart jumping every time someone walked past my door. Around midnight, I finally dozed off but jerked awake at 2 in the morning when someone slammed a car door outside. I didn't really sleep after that, just lay there watching the numbers on my clock change and trying to figure out what to do. At work the next morning, I scanned items on autopilot while my eyes tracked every single customer who came through my line. An older man buying bread and milk, a woman with 2 kids getting cereal and juice boxes, a teenager buying energy drinks and chips. Any of them could be watching me and reporting back to the family about whether I looked scared enough. I shortchanged a customer by $5 and didn't notice until they pointed it out, then did it again 20 minutes later to someone else. Greg came over during a slow period and asked if I was feeling okay because I seemed really out of it. I told him I hadn't been sleeping well and he said I needed to be more careful with the register because customers were complaining. A man came through my line buying zip ties and a bottle of bleach, and my stomach turned over even though he was probably just doing normal home repairs. I kept thinking about my cousin Polly and the stories I'd heard growing up about how he handled family problems. During my lunch break, I sat in my car and stared at the business card Tony had left under my windshield wiper. The Torino Construction logo looked so normal and professional, like any other family business instead of a front for money laundering and worse. I took out my phone and photographed the card from multiple angles, getting clear shots of the address and phone number. It felt like taking back some tiny bit of control, like I was gathering evidence even though I had no idea what I'd do with it. I opened my phone's browser and searched for news articles about Uncle Sal's case from 3 years ago. The headlines came up immediately talking about the construction bid rigging scheme and how federal prosecutors had broken up a major organized crime operation. My testimony was mentioned in every article as the key evidence that made the case, the family member who'd turned on her own blood. Reading about it made my hands shake again because it reminded me exactly how much they hated me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and when I opened it, the message just said, "TikTok." My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat and my hands got sweaty holding the phone. I stared at those 2 words for a full minute before I could make myself close the message and go back inside. The text meant they had my personal cell number now, not just my work address and apartment. They could reach me anytime they wanted to remind me the clock was running. I finished my shift smiling at customers and making small talk while my brain calculated how many days I had before the family lost patience. Every hour that passed felt like it was bringing me closer to something terrible. After work, I stopped at the drugstore and bought a small spiral notebook with cash, the kind students use for classes. Back in my car, I started writing down everything that had happened, starting with the customer who'd said your cousin says hi. I wrote the date and time as close as I could remember, then described exactly what he looked like and what he'd said. Then the business card under my windshield. Then Tony in my apartment with every detail I could remember about what he'd said and how he'd acted. Then the text message with the exact words and timestamp. I wrote it all out in careful detail like I was building a case file for someone, like documenting everything would somehow give me power over what was happening. Each entry got dated and timed and described as specifically as I could manage. It felt like something I could control when absolutely everything else in my life was spinning away from me. My phone rang during my break the next day and David's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but he'd just keep calling until I did. I picked up and tried to sound normal, but he asked immediately what was wrong because he could hear the stress in my voice. I told him work had been really busy lately and I was just tired from not sleeping well. He said I'd been distant the last few days and wanted to know if something was bothering me. I said everything was fine, I just had a lot on my mind with work stuff. He offered to bring dinner over to my place that night so we could talk and relax together. I made up an excuse about needing to catch up on laundry and get some real sleep, promising we'd hang out this weekend instead. The lie tasted awful in my mouth, but telling him the truth would put him directly in the family's crosshairs. He said okay, but I could tell he was hurt and confused about why I was pulling away. After we hung up, I sat there hating myself for lying to him, but knowing it was the only way to keep him safe. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner when I walked in that evening. I approached the front desk and asked to speak with someone about threats and harassment. The officer behind the plexiglass told me to wait, and 20 minutes later, a woman in a gray blazer called my name. Detective Francine Keller had short brown hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd heard every story twice. She led me to a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. I sat down and started explaining about an ex-boyfriend who wouldn't leave me alone, the prepared lie sliding out easier than I expected. She took notes while I described the business card under my windshield and vague threats about knowing where I lived. Her expression stayed professional but skeptical, like she could smell the half-truths. She asked why I didn't report someone breaking into my apartment immediately. I stumbled through an explanation about not being totally sure it happened, that maybe I'd left the cabinet open myself. Her pen stopped moving and she looked at me for a long moment before writing something else down. She said she'd file a report and increase patrols near my address, but without concrete evidence or direct threats, there wasn't much else she could do. I thanked her and left with a case number written on a business card that felt useless in my pocket. The hardware store was bright and loud with country music playing over the speakers. I found the security section and stared at door bars and window alarms trying to figure out what would actually help. A portable door security bar cost $40 and a pack of window alarms was another $20. I checked my bank balance on my phone and saw the numbers that made my chest tight, but I bought them anyway. Back at my apartment, I wedged the security bar under the door handle and tested it 3 times to make sure it held. The window alarms took longer to install, little white sensors that would scream if the glass moved. I placed one on each window and tested them all, the shrill beeping making my neighbors probably hate me. The whole setup took an hour and gave me something to do with my hands besides shake. I knew the family had already proven they could get in whenever they wanted, but doing nothing felt worse than useless barriers. The next afternoon, I finished my shift and walked out to the parking lot scanning for anyone watching. My car looked normal until I got close and saw my rear tire completely shredded. The rubber hung in strips around the rim like someone had taken a knife to it systematically. I stood there staring at it while other employees walked past to their cars. It took 3 calls to find a shop that could come out and replace it, and another 2 hours of sitting in my car waiting for them to arrive. The replacement tire cost $87, which was most of my emergency cash. By the time I got to my evening shift, I was 40 minutes late, and Greg was waiting at the time clock with his arms crossed. He wrote me up right there in front of 2 other employees and said I was using up my second chances fast. I apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again, but his expression said he'd heard that before from people who didn't last. During a slow period the next day, I was straightening the cereal aisle when I noticed a manila envelope tucked between 2 boxes of cornflakes in my lane. It wasn't there 10 minutes ago when I'd restocked that section. I looked around, but the store was nearly empty except for an old man by the deli counter. I picked up the envelope and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a printed photo of me and David sitting at the coffee shop last Saturday. We were laughing at something and his hand was on mine across the table. Someone had circled David's face in red marker, the circle thick and deliberate. There was no note, but I didn't need one. The message was clear as if they'd written it out. They could reach him anytime they wanted. I shoved the photo back in the envelope and stuffed it in my jacket pocket, my hands leaving sweat marks on the paper. I drove straight to David's apartment after work without calling first. He answered the door in his paramedic uniform between shifts and smiled when he saw me, but the smile faded fast. I told him we needed to talk and he let me in, his apartment smelling like the pizza he'd been eating. I stood by his couch instead of sitting and said I needed space, that things were moving too fast and I wasn't ready for this. He looked confused and asked what changed in the last week. I couldn't give him real answers, so I said something vague about work stress and personal stuff I was dealing with. He stepped closer and reached for my hand, but I pulled away. His face showed hurt that made my stomach turn, but staying away from him was the only way to keep him safe. David said he didn't accept that and he knew something was really wrong. He said I was scared of something and he wanted to help. I shook my head and told him he couldn't help with this, that I just needed him to give me space. He asked if this was about the guy who beat him up, and I said no, even though we both knew I was lying. His kindness made everything worse because I couldn't tell him the truth without painting a target on his back. I left his apartment with him calling after me, asking to please just talk to him. We weren't together anymore, but we weren't cleanly broken up either. Just stuck in some terrible limbo where he was hurt, and I was terrified. Back home, I dug through my emergency documents until I found the business card buried at the bottom of the box. Gabriel Blanchard, Assistant United States Attorney, with an office number in Chicago. He'd been the federal prosecutor who handled my testimony case 3 years ago. My hand hovered over my phone for 20 minutes while I tried to decide if calling him would make things better or worse. Finally, I dialed and got his voicemail. His voice professional and clipped. I left a message explaining I was the witness from the Torino case and I needed help, that the family had found me. I didn't expect him to remember me or even care after 3 years, but I left my number anyway and hung up feeling stupid. Tuesday night, I went to book club like I did every week, sitting in someone's living room drinking wine and pretending to discuss the novel. Halfway through, I realized my regular attendance was broadcasting my schedule to anyone watching. Every social media check-in at this house on Tuesday nights was a roadmap. I excused myself to the bathroom and deleted my accounts one by one. 3 years of carefully built normalcy disappeared as I hit confirm on each deletion. When I came back, the other members noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said work had been crazy lately, and I was just tired. The lies were getting easier, which probably meant something bad about who I was becoming. Gabriel called back the next morning while I was stocking shelves in the cereal aisle. I stepped outside into the parking lot to take it, my breath making clouds in the cold air. He remembered my case and asked why I didn't enter formal witness protection back then. I explained I thought disappearing on my own would be enough, that I didn't want to deal with all the federal restrictions and monitoring. He was blunt about the limited resources available for witnesses who declined protection initially. He said he'd make some calls, but I shouldn't expect the same level of support as official protected witnesses. I thanked him and we hung up. His honesty somehow worse than false hope would have been. The electronics store clerk barely looked at me when I bought the prepaid phone with cash. I memorized the number while sitting in my car, repeating it over and over until it stuck. My regular phone stayed active so the family would think I wasn't taking extra precautions. The burner went into my go bag hidden in the closet for emergencies only. Separating my communications felt like something from a spy movie, but it was the only way to have conversations they might not be listening to. I tested the burner by calling it from my regular phone and watching both devices light up. Then I turned the burner off and buried it under my spare clothes where nobody would find it unless they tore my apartment apart. The burner phone buzzed in my hand 20 minutes later, and I stared at the unknown number lighting up the screen. I answered without saying